And good afternoon. My name is Ryan Belmore. It is Thursday, June 15th, and we are being joined, as we normally are, for our interviews. Mr. Frank Prosnich joins me. Frank, how are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, and we have lots to get to today. So Newport Mayor Xaykham joins us. Mayor, how are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me on.
We have so many things that we could touch base on. One of the things that I wanted to this is why it's dangerous to prepare for interviews ahead of time, because in just the last couple minutes, it's changed. But I was going to ask you if you thought Charlie and the boys on 11th Hour could do it.
Oh.
And they were just involved in a collision while racing. Everybody seems to be safe. Boats are damaged, but it was looking pretty good there for Charlie and the local team.
It was looking as great as it's ever looked, right? I mean, they were in a great position. All they had to do was finish in the top three, and they were set to take the entire series of the ocean race. And in a port starboard collision with 11th Hour Racing in the right, you watched in horror, all right, as skipper Charlie and the team literally almost became human shish kebab as the bow sprint of Gio went right through the hull 11th Hour. Look, this is a race that has all sorts of setbacks that have occurred for all the teams. Charlie is no stranger to adversity. And so I'm holding out hope that they figure out a way to get back into this race. I'm just thankful that nobody on board was injured, and everybody should keep their fingers crossed and not count 11th Hour Racing out yet.
Never should. And Charlie and the rest of the team have made Rhode Island proud, Newport proud, and certainly it was great to have them last month. Big night last night, and Newport City Council adopted the FY 2024 budget. Some of the things that are new, several changes are some of the tax rates, as well as short-term rental fees, Newport Public School funding. Anything there that excites you?
No, Ryan, I think you covered it all, so we can move on.
Yeah.
Look, the most important policy budget that any legislative body passes, whether it's the federal government, the state, or us at the local level, is the operating budget, right? That controls what we have in terms of resources to ultimately try and achieve the policy objectives that we all hope to get done serving in office. And so looking at what the council ultimately passed last night was a major statement in terms of the policy objectives for this council. Now, I'm happy to walk through those if you want. We can do it through a Q&A type structure. But just as a quick recap and overview, you heard that housing was going to be a priority for this council. We passed a series of resolutions early on, probing in different areas to see where we might be able to help on the housing issue. And a lot of those had a deadline of June 30th. Now, we knew that some of those deadlines would have to get shifted based on what happened at the state level with changes to regulations that would impact a lot of these areas. But the reason why we gave that initial deadline was so that we could incorporate into the budget resources to help us ultimately pursue solutions in the field of housing. And that's exactly what we started to do with this budget. The first step that we knew we had to tackle was stopping the bleeding. We had to stop the erosion and the conversion of our housing stock into illegal short-term rentals. There are parts of the city that short-term rentals operate in that are appropriate. Those are the commercial zones. There are modified versions of this where maybe a resident is renting out a bedroom. That's a continuation of Newport's great tradition hosting. But you have these other areas where you've seen these investors come in, buy up middle-class homes and convert them into short-term rentals. Now, the city has some of those registered. These are the people who are playing by the rules, but the reality is that nearly 40% of the short-term rentals that are registering at the state level aren't registering at the local level. And so all the good ordinances and policies in the world aren't worth much if you don't have enforcement resources backing them up. That's exactly what we did with this budget. We put into the budget a full-time position, somebody at the aptitude level where they're going to be able to use technology to help go after these illegal short-term rentals. And it's all going to be funded using the registration fees for short-term rentals themselves. The second thing you knew that we had to do was stabilize the existing housing environment. So once we stop that bleeding, we've got to stabilize the patient. And that's really where you saw the two-tier tax structure start to come into play, right? That's one of those things that helps alleviate some of the strain that's being felt by local residents on the property tax front, hopefully giving them some breathing room to consider staying here locally. I think that program probably needs a fresh look now that we've gone through one cycle of it, we've seen what's happened, but we know that nearly 40% of homes in the city ultimately qualified for that deduction, and that's a valuable thing for them at the end of the day. They will be seeing on average at least $800 in savings, and so that's a major savings to the bottom line of a middle-class household. The final piece of this is we know that we need to plan for the future. We need to be thinking about where is it appropriate for the city to start building more middle income housing, and what can we be doing with our neighbors to partner for opportunities there. To that end, we added an employee to the planning staff and approved the hiring of an additional city solicitor to focus specifically on planning, zoning, and HDC issues. We're hoping that that makes the system more predictable. We're hoping it gives us some more forward-looking resources to help plan for the future in terms of housing, but really clear indication as to where we stand on housing. On the issue of infrastructure, another area that we made very clear we cared about, we doubled the road and sidewalk budget by using ARPA funds, but also leveraging available state resources to help us make sure we're investing more into our roads and sidewalks. That couples up really well with the consulting arrangement that we recently struck with an organization to do an assessment of the condition of our roads and sidewalks, so we can target those dollars in those areas that statistically are showing the greatest need. We also funded up the grant coordinator position that was hired midway through me coming on board this year. So that person is responsible for helping us coordinate our applications to federal funding opportunities that exist, as well as state funding opportunities. And we also hired another planner. So that's 2 new planners that have been added to the existing planning staff, nearly doubling the size of that staff, to help us start focusing on things like the North End and how we get ready to realize that gap that exists between when DOT wraps up this project and when ultimately, hopefully, we get to start realizing the great vision for the North End development plan that has been formed before. Finally, public education, right? Public education is incredibly important, and Newport needs to figure out ways to continue improving its public school performance. We looked at the operating budget request that was put forth by the school committee and decided to fund it in its entirety. But what's more important are the conversations that came out as a result of our budget process. We started digging in on the Rogers cost overruns. That's not part of the operating budget, clearly, but it's an area where we feel there's a greater need for transparency, a greater understanding for exactly where these cost overruns are coming from and what we can do to contain them. We also started the conversation around the city's operating budget on more of a multi-year basis, looking beyond the current year that we're in and looking forward. While the school's request in aggregate was for a 4% increase in the overall school budget, what that did not entirely reflect are all of the short-term federal funds that are being used that were related to recovery aid to staff up programs that are helping to close that educational gap that is tied to the COVID pandemic. Whether or not that job is going to get done in the past 2 years is yet to be seen, but I think we need to be thinking longer term about how we make sure our school system is appropriately staffed and ensuring that they have a clear strategic plan for how they're going to improve educational outcomes in our community. You heard a lot of frustration from the council on this front. I know the school committee also shares frustration on the challenges that they have to face. I think the 2 bodies are looking at how we can work together to make sure we have a more ongoing dialogue around the school's budget and how we can be supporting them, improving the school system to reach its ultimate educational potential.
And I
That
should
was a
point
lot.
out,
I haven't gone back through any of those things. So
I know. Well, I was also going to point out, if people are looking to learn about any of the items you just mentioned, within the last 15 minutes, the city of Newport issued a press release on the 24 budget, and that has been posted on What'sUpNewp.com as well, where you can read and get all into all the rates and things like that, so we don't bore everybody right now. But all of that information is publicly available, either City of Newport's website, What'sUpNewp, or you can go back if you are really into it and watch the video from last night's meeting, which, I mean, what better way to spend 3-4 hours?
Indeed. I did want to unpack some of these things.
it wasn't that long.
Lots of questions.
Yeah, it was only about 2 hours, but you have to realize that this is the result of over a half a dozen public meetings that we did, including an all-day session. We went department by department through every single line of the city's budget, looking at everything that was currently being spent, asking questions about things as minuscule as how many radios the fire department is purchasing in the next capital budget. So we really got into the weeds on this. It was a good experience for the entirety of this council. This is a process that started back in April. In addition to those public meetings, are constant dialogue and questions that councilors are asking of the city's finance staff, of the different departments. So at the end of the day, a good result. Like I said, a little under 2 hours for the entirety of the meeting, which given the scheme of the lift of what we were accomplishing, I think was a pretty efficient meeting.
So I want to start from the back end, if you will, and the education piece.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about looking at the cost overruns at Rogers. What have you found to be the major problem? And as I look around the state, what's happened at Rogers is very consistent with what's happening in Warwick and what's happening elsewhere in terms of projected budgets are now being basically blown out of the water.
Yeah, and I think the challenge we face, as much as what the drivers are over the cost run, is when are we actually going to find out how much these cost overruns are, right? What is that timeline? And the reason I care about that is because that date, that time is when all of a sudden we have a clear look at how much of a gap we're going to have to close. We can start figuring out what the plan is to close that gap. What's been tough, right, is that a lot of the numbers that are floating out around there right now are not concrete. And that makes it very challenging to budget. We heard in our interviews with the school building committee, with the school committee itself, with the project manager on that 40% of the bids have been received to account for 70% of the expenses. And yet we still don't have what the breakdown is of where those bids have landed. We're getting it in bits and pieces. We just got the HVAC quote in at the past meeting. And so we're working towards pressing for more clarity around that, because at some point, what you end up doing is entering into a guaranteed maximum price contract with a contractor. And the sooner we can figure out what that's going to be, the sooner we can start working together to figure out how it is that we're going to close that gap between what the voters originally approved and what the ultimate cost of this project to realize what they were expecting will be settled out.
Mayor, when it comes to housing, I had go ahead, Frank.
No, that's all right. I wanted to stay on the education piece a little bit. Why don't you have those numbers? Is there anybody? Is it because of the process? Is it because of the contractor? What's preventing you from having the numbers that you need?
Yeah, that process is run by the school building committee, right? So that's not our office. That's not a contract that our office executed. That is one with the school building committee, an entity that is set up under state law to actually run the management of the construction of that project itself. So we're pressing for it. We will continue to press for it through a series of public hearings. There are a number of issues that have arisen since with the construction that go beyond just the expense of that construction, including a dirt pile in that neighborhood that has raised concern that we are digging in on to make sure that it is being managed in an appropriate fashion. And so for us, right, we're left with the similar frustration that a lot of residents are, that this is not an entity that's directly accountable to the city council. This is an entity that's accountable to the school building committee. And so we have to figure out ways to work with them to get that information.
You also mentioned that you had approved the budget increase for the schools, which is unique in the state. Many of them are level funding school systems. And then you also mentioned a commitment to full staffing. While the National Education Association has been predicting that perhaps half of the teachers out there are going to retire after this year, are going to leave the profession. Have you taken a look at that or addressed that, or is there any plan on somehow to be able to address it and maybe overcome what looks like a mass exodus from the profession?
Well, that also, aligns with declining school populations. We know that Rogers' school population has been declining, right? So as you start to look at the natural attrition that's happening with retirements, it's probably an appropriate time to look at what the appropriate staffing levels are within our public schools. Now, conversely, the business of education is notably more challenging today than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago when many of these teachers started. And so we need to start thinking about what are the new teachers that we recruit into this school system going to look like. We have a majority minority school system where less than 10% of the teachers are people of color. And so the ability for these classrooms to start reflecting both on the teacher side of the desk, but also on the student side of the desk is something that I think we're going to be presented with a unique opportunity to start reforming as time goes on with how we rehire and work with our teachers. Our teachers, at the end of the day, are the core of our learning system in this community. They're the most important people when it comes to getting this job done. And so we need to be thinking about how we not only retain the best teachers that we have, but how we recruit teachers in the future. They're going to be transformative in the ways that we need in order to improve our public education system.
Ryan, you want to talk housing?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to hit on taxes as well as short-term rentals. Bill wrote in, and I'm sure you or city staff have been asked this question a million times, so I'm just wondering what the answer is for all those out there. What is the logic of part-time residents who do not rent their properties being taxed more than full-time residents when the part-time residents are provided city services for only a portion of the year?
Yeah, look, our part-time residents that are here for a portion of the year are wonderful. They're incredible contributors to our local economy when they're here. They're incredible contributors to the boards and commissions and nonprofits that we have that are at the nonprofit level within the community. But the reality at the end of the day is that the prior council made a decision relative to how we were going to balance the property tax burden, which this council followed through with. And part of their logic at that point in time is that while these residents are only here consuming resources for a portion of the year, they're also only here contributing to the economy for a portion of the year. The street light outside their house, the road itself, the garbage pickup, that all still has to keep happening year round, whether or not they are there. That truck still goes by, that light still gets turned on, that road still has to get repaved. The challenge that we have when we look at the impact of having somebody who is not a resident here year round, just here for part of the year, is that when it comes to the other types of aid that we receive, things like state and federal aid, that is based on the per capita population of this community, which is based on the year-round population. When you look at what we receive in state aid, it is a sliver, a small portion compared to what is received by any other community in the state. And so we need to start being considerate about how it is that we're supporting residents that are here year round. And the resident tax deduction was really more about giving the residents that are here year round, contributing year round, a slight break than it was for penalizing those residents that are only here for part of the year. Again, those residents are terrific. We're taking a fresh look at this two-tiered tax structure to figure out what is the appropriate balance of those taxes. But that was the logic employed by the prior council that we executed on in this budget.
And sticking on short-term rentals, the fight or your involvement in the conversation certainly is not over. The House yesterday, the Rhode Island House, bill sponsored by Rep. Carson, who represents Newport, approved a new commission that will study the economic and social effects of the short-term rental industry. And among the 15 members that will make up that commission include 4 representatives, state tax administrator, and the mayors of Newport and Warwick. What do you hope is accomplished by this new commission that was just approved yesterday?
Well, first, Lauren Carson has done a terrific amount of work advocating on the issue of illegal short-term rentals at the State House. This is a new industry, and I think what you see is all of us at the state and local level trying to figure out how it is that we get some level of control around this industry so we can appropriately regulate it from a community impact perspective, from a safety perspective. And so this commission is going to be the way that the legislature looks holistically at all the different impacts that are coming out of short-term rentals being active in our communities. And these are kind of an awkward thing. These are, for the most part, residential structures that are being used for commercial purposes. And so they've fallen into this regulatory gray area, and ensuring that we are appropriately regulating these businesses in ways that are fair, that are predictable, is really important. I felt for those operators of short-term rentals who said, this is a big fee increase that you've levied upon us in order to fund the regulation of our industry. But at the end of the day, my feeling consistently is that if you have an industry that is operating for the benefit of people in that industry, that industry should be bearing the burden of it itself being regulated. I don't see why the average taxpayer should be having to carry the burden of regulating short-term rentals when that wasn't something that existed 6 years ago. And I think we hit a pretty good balance with the fee structure we proposed. And I'm confident that Representative Carson's study commission will be looking more broadly at different ways we can do this in a more fair manner in the future.
And I just want to point out on that commission also there's 15 people. I'm not going to read the whole list, but there will be some people from that industry, an owner of a small owner-occupied short-term rental property, the owner of another larger one that is over 8 units. So there will be, the entire conversation will be sitting down on this commission to come up with some regulations. It's not just going to be hopefully it's a well-rounded conversation.
Yeah, and there are 2 good actors to pay attention to in the short-term rental space, right? The first is that you do have people who are, living in their property, who are renting out a room, and this is an extension of Newport's great tradition hosting people in this community in their own homes. Our symbol is the pineapple for a reason, right? This is an area where hospitality is one of our defining features, not just because of our hotel industry, but because of our individuals in our homes that have traditionally had that role. The second are people who are operating in commercial districts, right? They're already in places where there are hotels. They're providing an alternative, to hotels when regulated and done properly are appropriate and are offering an alternative housing arrangement for people who are traveling to stay in our community. What we're really trying to get after here, right, are 2 things. First, illegal operators of short-term rentals, right? That house that you see that's operating as short-term rental that never seems to get cracked down upon, we need to have an enforcement mechanism not only to appropriately document the violation, but then to follow through in court to make sure that whatever fines they're hit with ultimately stick. The second is the actual platform operators themselves. We need to be making sure that the amounts of funds that are being remitted to us are appropriate and that we can account for them in ways where we can track where they're actually being originated from. We don't have that level of clarity yet, and so we need to get to that sophistication level, and that's going to require help from the state as well as resources from the city.
So you mentioned, I think, that the short-term rentals register with the state, but that only 40% that register with the state register locally. I don't understand how that isn't consistent. If they register with the state, does that not show up locally?
That's correct. So it's actually an inverted percentage, right? So 60% of those that are registered with the city are also registered with the state. So I'll give you the numbers. Around 327 short-term rentals are registered in the city of Newport. When we asked last night how many were registered at the state level that reflected a Newport address as where they were operating their property, that number was north of 500. Right. And so that's a big differential. That's a big pool of people who have just decided not to register at the city level. And so we need to be going after those individuals to ensure they comply. In addition to that are obviously those other actors who just haven't registered anywhere and are continuing to operate these rogue properties. We need to crack down on those. It's a matter of not only our community fabric, but also of safety.
Do you think that 500 number even represents close to the number of short-term rentals that are operating in the city unlicensed?
I do. I think that we're not wildly off with that. And so I'm hopeful that we can keep pressing closer to compliance. I also think that the reality is that the economics at some point of short-term rentals will hit a saturation point. But we're not going to sit around and wait for that point to be met, right? We're going to make sure we get there. And like I said earlier, it's also a matter of safety, right? You've got people coming in, staying in homes, staying in facilities. If they're transient facilities, they need to be inspected for fire safety. They need to be inspected for code. This is a very compact, dense city. And so we have to take things like safety very seriously.
I guess I have one follow-up is it feels like the last couple of years or last couple of sessions, it's really come down to cities and operators instead of, or government and operators instead of government and the platforms. I feel like that fight has kind of, people have walked away from that fight because there's just no hope there. So it's to go with the operators themselves.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different routes that you can go on regulation, and I don't think that one route versus the other is the answer. I think you have to be pursuing both. It's exactly what we're talking about doing here. On the one hand, we're going to be cracking down on individual property owners that are not complying with the law. On the second, we're going to be holding the platforms accountable to make sure that they're playing by the rules and they're remitting an appropriate amount of funds to us. We need to have complete certainty and clarity that we're getting compliance on both ends of that spectrum in order to ensure that this industry is one that's operating in a responsible manner in our city.
You mentioned middle income housing as I guess an area. Does that differ from what everybody talks about affordable housing?
It does.
So you're not. I know that Newport is among those communities that meets the state minimum, the 10% plus for affordable housing. We have a shortage of middle income housing, and what kind of housing are you thinking about?
Yeah, so we don't just meet the standard. We are at the top of the list in terms of our concentration of affordable housing on a per capita basis. And so Newport is proud of that. What we need is middle-class housing, middle-income housing. We need housing for our firefighters, our school teachers, the people that work in the tourism industry here in Newport, the people that work at nonprofits at places like Salve Regina, at the Preservation Society. And when you look at the average income needed to purchase a home in the city of Newport being $170,000 a year, that indicates that the gap that we have in housing that we need to address is middle income, right? So anything from workforce to middle income. What we're talking about here are people who are making north of 80% of the area median income, as high as 140 to 150% of the area median income. So what does this look like, right? What does a middle income housing solution potentially look like? Well, the Cranston Calvert School is a good example. Right, the Cranston Calvert School is a property that has rents that are in that $1,400 to $2,200 range, depending on how nice your specific unit is. These are single bedroom, smaller footprint type units. It's completely occupied by people who live and work in Newport, and so you have a high concentration of people who are walking to work instead of driving cars. It's the exact type of project that we should be looking at how we develop in the city when it comes to developing housing. We also need to be realistic about working with our neighbors and our partners on this, right? We need to be looking at how we can help Middletown get up to a higher level of affordable housing, and also how we can start to shift more middle income housing to Middletown as well. I think regional solutions are going to be really important when we start looking at some of these bigger issues we're tackling. By putting some policy resources in place, we're hopeful that we'll be able to continue to identify ways to do that.
Mayor, we're already starting to run up against the clock here, and I want to be respectful of your time. Big week for news for the Cliff Walk. When do you think we could start to see some progress there?
As soon as we can get the money. So this has been a long process, as things always seem to be. We did two things that are important. First, we've taken a double barrel approach to tackling the Cliff Walk. Typically what you do is you do an engineering study, let the engineers take their time, and then you eventually go out and you pursue funding, you get the funding back in, you go back to the engineering companies, you do an RFP to actually build out, and then you do the build. In this instance, what we did is we double tracked it. I said, look, this is one of the most important cultural assets that we have here in Newport. It is an absolutely iconic part of our shoreline, and so we need to get on top of fixing it as quickly as possible. We accelerated those preliminary engineering reports in tandem with actually pursuing different avenues of funding from the federal government. So what we ultimately received yesterday is a disaster declaration from the governor's office, the result of months of advocacy from us at the city level, from our nonprofit partners, from other people in the community, to ultimately get that disaster declaration that unlocks a pathway for us to pursue federal funding through disaster aid relief. Now, whether or not we get that funding is not a slam dunk. We've got to make our case for it. We've got to pursue it. But now having the state with us on this, advocating, is a great step forward. In addition to that, we have also been working with the offices of Senator Whitehouse and Senator Reed to try and get a congressional earmark allocation to help us go about fixing the Cliff Walk itself. I'm hopeful that we're going to get this work started in fiscal year 24, but we obviously need to make sure that we have the money in hand first so we can proceed forward with actually fixing the Cliff Walk itself.
And I will make a note that for anybody who is listening or watching, that the Cliff Walk in majority is still open. Please go up there and still enjoy it. You just have a brief detour. But the Cliff Walk is still open. Mayor, was there anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to discuss today? I know there's so much on your plate.
You know what? Before that, I'd just like if you can just touch on briefly the North End development, where we're at, and what are the prospects?
Excellent question, Frank. So the reality of the North End is that while we have done great planning work for the ultimate vision that we would like to see realized out there, what we need to do right now is build the bridge between when DOT finishes its project and how we actually get to a point where we can start to think about drawing in developers to pursue that land. This is land, as you drive through it right now, it is complicated, right? It is not a clear level terrain. There are environmental remediation issues that need to be sorted out. There are stormwater issues that need to get sorted out. There are issues regarding the underlying infrastructure in that area that need to get fixed and addressed before building can happen. So the ultimate objective should be making sure that we have sites and pads that are ready to attract the types of development that we want, not just whoever it is that's willing to show up and cut us a check. And so that process of acquiring the land itself and preparing it for ultimate marketing is where I think the city council is going to be focusing over the balance of its term.
Anything new on the former casino property?
That falls into that same category. As we look up there, right, that former casino property sits on top of a site that has both environmental remediation issues and stormwater issues. As we start to think about working with that parcel, which is, almost 40% of the overall acreage for that area, it has to be included as part of a comprehensive approach to addressing development in that area. We have been in ongoing conversations with Carpianato. I'm confident that we're going to be able to hopefully get them to a position where they're ready to start developing that site itself as the initial linchpin to developing that entire region.
Mayor, was there anything on your notepad that you wanted to bring up today?
No, I think we covered a lot today. Obviously, a lot of moving pieces in the city, a lot of change, right? This is a budget that I think reflects a very heavy shift towards long-range planning and policy. It also, I think, hopefully strikes a cooperative tone with our public schools to start working towards solutions to some major issues. Looking forward, there are obviously going to be some pretty major changes in what our city looks like with, hopefully a process that we'll be going through around personnel and staffing. And so stay tuned for more. I'm looking forward to future conversations and keeping you all updated on all the good work that's happening here at the city.
Excellent. And we won't talk before then. Well, we won't do this again before then, but 4th of July is coming up. And the fireworks, City of Newport's fireworks display will be on Tuesday, July 4th. There's a fundraising campaign going on, as there has been for years. This is nothing new, but if there are any companies, business owners, people that have a little bit deeper of a pocket and want to contribute to a great fireworks display, they can do that by visiting the City of Newport's website as well.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, Ryan. I can tell you my signing hand is sore from all the letters we've been sending out. We've got great business partners in Newport that have come through to help make this community tradition possible. It's looking great for this year, and I just can't thank the community enough for the outpouring of support to make sure that we have these 4th of July fireworks on the 4th of July this year. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yes, of course. All right, Mayor. Well, we will chat with you soon. It's summer now, so are we on once a month city council meetings?
We're still plowing ahead with a consistent schedule that we have because we're not quite into summer mode yet. But when we scale back, we'll definitely let you know.
All right, excellent. Well, I appreciate it, Mayor, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you much.
All right, Mayor Sy joins us, and always up for joining us anytime we invite him on. And it's nice to have him right after a council meeting to kind of break down everything that happened. And those meetings are jam-packed.
Well, they should be. They get paid a lot. No, maybe they don't.
No, they don't. And, just a reminder, if you want to read anything, the budget isn't always the easiest thing to understand, but you can read about the several changes to both the revenue and expenditures, the tax rate, as well as short-term rental fees, Newport Public School funding, all available on What'sUpNewp.com now, as well as the new commission on short-term rentals. That story is up. And one more is the Cliff Walk, the disaster declaration. You'll find lots of coverage on that as well on our website. Lots of stuff on there, Frank.
I thought he touched on a lot of important areas. I thought the North End in particular, and I thought his answer to the question of the former casino property and the environmental concerns with that was somewhat explanatory for the length of time it's taken for anything to happen there.
Absolutely. And I will just make a note that also joining us every month is Newport School Superintendent Colleen Burns-Germain. The next time she'll join us and we can get an update on all that is Newport Public Schools is on the 28th of this month, and she will join us at 1:30 p.m. So June 28th, 1:30, we'll have the superintendent on with us, and then we'll have the mayor back on with us at the start of July again.
And tomorrow we have Will Safran.
Yes,
I'm pronouncing
on
it
a
correctly.
completely different plate.
Yep.
But yes, he'll be joining us, and Master and Commander is coming to Jane Pickens Theater. He wrote a book about the boat that sailed from Newport all the way around to get to California. So he'll be joining us to chat about that tomorrow morning.
And about the event itself that's coming up, it sounds pretty exciting.
Excellent. All right, Mr. Prositz.
All right. I'll see you tomorrow morning.
I'll see you soon. Thank you. On behalf of Frank and all of us here at What's Up Newp, we want to thank Mayor Sy for joining us. If you missed any portion of this interview, want to watch it again, want to listen to it, want to share with friends, family, enemies, or anybody else in Newport, you can find it all on What'sUpNewp.com. Thanks for watching.